Hi, this is Ms. Hattie. This is part 2 of a lecture on Neolithic culture. We just finished talking about how agricultural production led to more people, so demographic growth, and how that eventually led to more specialization of labor. And we were beginning to talk about some of the earliest craft industries that developed because of that specialization of labor. So this is one of the effects of increased agriculture. You can find this information in your book, and they're basically, your book's going to describe 3 of the major industries: pottery, metallurgy, and textile production. Your book argues that one of the first and earliest industries to emerge was pottery. In the Neolithic period, pottery becomes important because you need a place to store your extra food, your surplus food that you've made. And pottery becomes also like a vehicle for expressing your art. People develop glazes and they make their pottery into beautiful different forms, artistic forms. You can read about that in your book. Some historians debate that pottery was not, they say pottery was not the first industry potentially, but our book says that it was. So then what could have possibly been an even older industry? Well, some argue that it was textile production, or the production of things like clothes and hats. And some historians even say that the Venus figurines that we've studied in the past, this has been interpreted as potentially a hairstyle or a hairdo. Other historians say no, that's an old type of hat, haberdashery. But the problem with textiles is that they disintegrate over time, and so it becomes very hard to prove that, although in the future, some historians might find evidence that does help them prove that textiles actually predate pottery as an industry. Okay, so you learned about pottery, you learned about textile industry. I told you that those are some of the 2 oldest industries. You also have the metallurgy as an industry. Metallurgy is the working of metals, and one of the oldest metals that humans worked was copper because it was more abundant and it was also malleable. And then as they learned to heat pottery up, they could pour it into different molds and make different kinds of jewelry. And then from there, they could also make different kinds of weapons. So that was one of the earliest industries that we know about. And then I already mentioned about textile production. All of this concentration of people into a smaller land area is going to lead to more dense populations, so villages, towns, eventually cities. And it's also going to cause the institutionalization of privately owned land as a form of property and as a form of wealth, which is going to give birth to social distinctions based on wealth. So this is really significant change that we see in the agricultural period, social distinctions based on owning land. We want to think of land as the biggest symbol of wealth, and that makes sense. In agricultural society, you can't have food if you don't have land to grow it in. So that becomes really important. We have evidence that there are social distinctions based on wealth in the burial sites of Catalhayok, and also in the decorations that people use to decorate their houses. So it tells us some people had more stuff in their burial site than others, which means some people probably were more wealthy than others. Okay, so you can read about that there. This is very significant. Make sure you understand that land is a form of wealth. Next, we're going to get into religious values, and that's a type of something that we just study for Neolithic culture. First of all, there's a real interest in the natural environment, and that makes sense because, of course, they depended on the natural environment to grow agriculture, so they had to learn about the different seasons and how plants grew. And so some of their deities or gods and goddesses reflect this interest in the natural world. And we see some continuations from Paleolithic times. So, for example, a continuation of interest in fertility. In the Venus figurines that we studied before, we also see a lot of drawings and depictions on pots and vases that have to do with things from nature, representations of goddesses that are associated with nature. We also see a lot of interest in deities that represent the cycle of life, death, and regeneration, potentially representing Neolithic hopes for fertility in the fields. We also see interest in animals that transform a lot throughout their lives, like frogs and butterflies. And for male gods, we see an interest in bulls and goats, which represent sort of the vitality of life. Some of the deities were also associated with death, so you guys can read about that. Again, this has to do with sort of the Neolithic interest in the crops. Basically, a lot of their religious views are having to do and reflect on their interest in the natural world and the fact that their society is agricultural. There's going to be one more thing I need to teach you about, which is the origins of urban life, and I'll do that in another quick video.